Hi, friends, and happy Friday. It's been a long week, and we are now down to Friday, my favorite day of the week, where we go down and travel the spiritual path. I want to thank you for being part of this journey of mine as I travel through faith, freedom, and finance and bring all of that together. Today, we're going to unpack some of the top news of the day and some of the things that really do shape our world. And then in the second half, we're going to travel down the spiritual path and today talk about something that's shaping our culture, conscience over consensus. So stay with me as we travel down the Steve Beaman journey.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
In a world of uncertainty, where business, freedom, and the future hang in the balance, one voice rises with clarity, experience, wisdom, and conviction. This is the Steve Beaman Show, the voice of the independent American.
Welcome back, and I want to thank you for joining me. You know, I'm constantly trying to make this better. I did take the advice of several of the people who watch when they said, let's go ahead and proceed down using the 5 paths. So the way that's going to work, every Monday we'll talk about money. We'll talk about the markets and different ideas and concepts in financial literacy. We'll try to make it hit home. Tuesdays, we'll talk about the emotional path and things that can make us break out of our emotional boundaries and hit new heights. Wednesday, we'll talk about the intellectual path and how we can develop and further our intellectual thoughts. And Thursday, we'll cover the physical path. That's just going to be new ideas in health and wellness. We're on a huge pro-protein kick in this country. We'll talk about what that does in reality. But Fridays are kind of the day we set for the weekend ahead, and we're going to ground it in spiritual topics. And I'm excited to talk with you each and every week about it. This is called the Steve Beaman Journey because it's my journey. All of us have been through crises in our lives. I've been through a number of them. I've had great highs and great lows. This journey is about me trying to really give back in the second half of my life and to try to do something that can benefit not just myself, but those around me. So I want to thank very much everybody for joining me. And we do have 2 parts to the program. Every day we go through news of the day that affects you, and then we tie that news to the path that we're on. So today, I want to talk about the Nobel Prize decision. It was just announced that the Nobel Prize will be given to a Venezuelan activist, an opposition leader against authoritarian power, and that's a good thing. But it did deny the Nobel Prize to Donald Trump. Now, you can love Trump or you can hate Trump, but the facts really do point to the biases in the Nobel Committee. And I want to go back and I want to take a look at what this is over time, because this decision by the Nobel Committee has really reignited a debate about whether that process is so political that it can no longer represent idea, or well, I'll say actions, but it's all about political stuff. So let me go back with you and rewind the history a little bit on the Middle East and let you know what's gone on to bring it to where we are today. The discussion starts in 1979. Now, I go back, I remember when this happened, and Carter had what were called the Camp David Accords. This was the first time he'd brought any Middle Eastern countries together with Israel. Egypt, very strongly supporting trying to get peace in the Middle East, for the first time recognized Israel as a legitimate state. This was a huge step in normalizing relationships between Egypt and Israel. I mean, this was an unprecedented meeting of Jimmy Carter, Anwar Sadat, and Menachem Begin. Now, there was a high price paid for this, to be sure. Sadat was murdered 2 years later specifically because of this. But in response to this groundbreaking peace, the Nobel Prize Committee gave the Nobel Prize in Peace to Jimmy Carter, Menachem Begin, and Anwar Sadat. It makes sense. Roll the clock forward to the 90s. Bill Clinton and his administration went back to the peace table, trying to create a lasting peace, and they brought together Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat at the White House and signed what became known as the Oslo Accords. Again, hope filled the air on these things. The committee celebrated, and again, it gave the Nobel Prize to Clinton and Rabin and Yasser Arafat because they believed there would be peace in the Middle East. We'll roll that clock forward just a little bit, go back to 2011. President Bush shifted to a counterterrorism focus, but President Obama tried once again to bring peace to the Middle East. But before he did anything, he was awarded the Nobel Prize based on hope that he was providing. Not outcomes, but hope. So we gave a Nobel Peace Prize in '79. We gave a Nobel Peace Prize in the '90s. We gave a Nobel Peace Prize to Barack Obama in the 2000s. Roll the clock forward to 2020. This came as no one expected it. Trump announced what became a consensus formula, that peace must begin answering the Palestinian question. So instead of just focusing on one dimension, they built cooperation around the shared interest of the Middle East. The result became known as the Abraham Accords. This was a huge breakthrough in Middle East peace, and for the first time, countries like the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, Sudan normalized relationships with Israel. And as a result, you had embassies reopening, tourism beginning between those countries, and commerce being shared. This was a major step in the recognition of Israel's right to exist. This was huge, and for the first time since 1979, Arab and Israeli leaders stood together on the White House lawn. This was the most substantive Middle East process, in 30 years. But when the Nobel Committee got together, well, they looked away. Politics of it, they decided, was just too messy. The man behind this was too controversial. But look at real outcomes of real work versus just talk. You can't eliminate Donald Trump from real outcomes. But bring it forward to today. In October, just now, Hamas and Israel have signed agreements, and I found it fascinating how Trump got to this. He went to the leadership, to Mr. Netanyahu, the premier of Israel, and said, if you don't sign this, we're cutting off our aid. So Israel said, well, okay, we have no choice then but to sign it, but what if they don't agree to it? What if Hamas doesn't live up to it? He went to Hamas and said, if you don't agree to this, I'm going to unleash Israel to have unlimited power on you. So both sides were given a hammer and they were given a carrot. And at the end of the day, they signed the peace agreements. But Israel is now extending a peace ceasefire, and Hamas is agreeing that on Monday, come this 3 days from now, they'll release the balance of the hostages. This is perhaps the most significant Middle Eastern peace ever. And if this fragile calm holds, this will mark clearly the longest sustained quiet in nearly 2 decades. But again, just as with the Abraham Accords, the Nobel Prize looked the other way. Donald Trump is just too much for them to handle. But let's look to the president and congratulate him for what he's doing without the applause. He believes prosperity is stronger than hatred. So that's the point of all this, I guess. Recognition from elites. Well, I'd rather have accomplishment in reality. History shows that Nobel often honors symbols, not substance. Kissinger, during the Vietnam War, received the Nobel Prize. That was a terrible war with 57,000 American lives lost. Arafat, he got a Nobel Prize despite the enormous terror he brought upon the Middle East. Obama got it before he'd ever done anything, just based on his speeches of hope. But men and women who actually changed the course of history often do so without applause. So kudos, President Trump. That's conscience over consensus. It's the same spirit that led our founders to sign the Declaration of Independence. They knew they'd be branded as traitors. It's the same courage that drives entrepreneurs who act on conviction rather than comfort. So we do right, even when the world fails to applaud. History, not headlines, decide who truly earn the prizes in the long run. So with that stability being brought to the Middle East, the administration and we can move our focus to Ukraine. this troubled hotspot that has the potential to become really problematic. It's now entering its fourth winter, and that cannot be good for the citizens of Ukraine. Well, let's remember it was just a few weeks ago that President Trump met with President Putin in Alaska. Their first face-to-face meeting since the election, of course, and the symbolism was very powerful. There was, however, no breakthrough, no joint statement, just neutral ground, northern ice, and cold diplomacy. Since that time, Putin has doubled down. As you follow in the evening news, you know this. He's increased his bombing. He's increased his cyber attacks on Europe. He's moved tactical nuclear weapons closer to Belarus. These are not the moves that we hope to see. But it's the clearest sign yet that Moscow believes that time, not talk, is in its favor. Well, in response to this, the Trump administration has dramatically shifted its strategy. It's gone from one of deterrence to one of strength, authorizing accelerated arms shipments to Kyiv, including long-range missile systems that can hit the heart of Russian infrastructure. I mean, Trump's argument is that for 2 years he said diplomacy will win the war. Now he's starting to say, as in the Middle East, no, we've got to bring a risk to the Russians to this. And so he's offering now very strategic advanced weapons to Ukraine. It's a gamble. I mean, it's a reset of the global chessboard. But the problem is, and the question that you and I have to ask, is what happens if one of those U.S. missiles housed in Ukraine hits Moscow? How will Putin respond? This war isn't about territory anymore, at least with inside Russia. It's about pride, ego, and survival. Putin's government has shown that it can absorb casualties, sanctions, and isolation rather than admitting defeat. Well, when pride replaces policy, logic collapses. And that's when small sparks can ignite big problems. I go back to something you'll hear me talk about often, and that's the book, The Guns of August. This is a book about how World War I was created really by accidental behaviors on the part of national leaders. I don't want to see Ukraine become another accidental calamity. I mean, let's not forget where it began. Go back a couple of years, and the analysts, the experts in all of this, the elites predicted Kyiv would fall within 3 days. Well, it didn't. The courage of the ordinary Ukrainians, the bakers, the farmers, the coders, they stunned the world. But after nearly 4 years now, the cities that they've rebuilt after being bombed have been bombed again. Exhaustion is setting in. Millions have been displaced, and no end is in sight. So where does conscience meet policy? I mean, for America, it's the tension there between moral duty and strategic wisdom. We must stand for freedom as Americans, always, always. But we must remember as well that endless war isn't a policy, it's a wound. True leadership seeks peace through strength, not pride through escalation. For the independent American, conflict still touches our daily lives. Energy prices are again volatile because this sanctions tighten global supply chains. Fertilizer and grain inflows through the Black Sea remain uncertain, and that's affecting the volatility in the farming markets. And inflation, I've heard this referred to, and I think it's exactly accurate, as an echo of war. That echo of war is still affecting people, with high interest rates making it expensive and fragile. So plan ahead, keep reserves high, and hedge your energy exposure. As always, be adaptable to a changing world. But the lessons of Ukraine post-Alaska is this: courage without humility hardens into hubris. And nations, like people, can lose themselves chasing victory instead of peace. Well, we pray that conscience, not consensus, guide the next move. But as we move from Ukraine, understanding that the Middle East, Ukraine, goes to another hotspot, and that's China. While the world's cameras are fixed on the Middle East and the Ukraine, China is beginning to make consequential actions over there. Just 2 weeks after the Putin-Trump meeting in Alaska, China's President Xi convened what the state media has called a Council on National Rejuvenation. In plain signals, or plain terms, this was a signal from Beijing. They believe the global order is shifting and shifting in their favor so that the 21st century will belong to them. Well, we disagree with that. The headlines coming out of this conference were very subtle. There were no dramatic declarations, no new trade deals, no invasions, of course, but the underlying message was unmistakable. China is tightening its grip on critical resources, tightening its grip on digital infrastructure, global influence, and it's betting that America and Europe are too distracted by the Middle East and Ukraine. Well, let's start with basic economics. China controls about 70% of the rare earth minerals that we need in our daily production for all kinds of things, the elements of magnets and computer chips and electric vehicles and all that. More than that, they're responsible for the processing of 90% of all rare earth minerals. So when you get a magnet or an electric car or a semiconductor, almost all of that comes off of the Chinese soil. These aren't just minerals that we're talking about. These are the oxygen of the current modern life, the digital age. From your phone to your laptop to electric vehicles, missiles and semiconductors, everyone depends on what comes out of the Chinese soil. So this week, the Chinese Commerce Ministry announced new export restrictions on two specifically, graphite and gallium. These are key minerals for semiconductors and electric vehicles, and analysts are now calling this the rare earth squeeze 2.0. It's retaliation for Western limits on advanced chip sales to China. So while the U.S. is debating aid for Ukraine, Beijing is waging an economic war that could strangle supply chains in 6 months. This we need to be aware of. But it's not just about minerals. It's about mindset. Beijing is racing to dominate artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and digital surveillance by exporting these things across the developing world. Through its Digital Silk Road initiative, and we've talked about that before, and we'll talk about it again, Chinese telecom and data companies now provide infrastructure for more than 60 countries on the planet. That's a lot. This not only gives them access to communication networks, but it gives them access to information. I mean, that's not just influence, that's very strong leverage. Now, you combine that with the military picture. China's naval activity toward Taiwan has increased by 40% this summer. Amphibious landing drills in the South China Sea are now routine. U.S. intelligence believes that China is just flat testing how the U.S. will respond to pressure as they escalate through the Taiwan issue. Xi isn't looking for war tomorrow. You can be sure about that. They take a long view on everything. But he is preparing for war 5 years from now. This is not what the U.S. wants, and China is trying to set the global trade agenda for the next 100 years. So what does this really mean to you? Why do we even talk about it? Well, there's two things that this China situation brings up, opportunity and a warning. If we look at opportunity, you and I can talk about every time China restricts exports, the door opens wider for domestic production, reshoring, and regional manufacturing. We're already seeing small plants in the Midwest of the United States reopen to process these rare material substances and even magnetic materials. We're seeing that happen now. This is part of Trump's bringing in new capital to the country. This is where entrepreneurial America wins. We build what the globalists outsourced away. It's the entrepreneur and the small business, the 36 million of them who've kept this thing going. But it's also a warning. If there's a good, there's a bad. And that's because dependency is moral as much as economics or economic. We built the imbalance over the last 30 years. For decades, we traded security for convenience. We traded sovereignty for cheap labor. Consensus said efficiency is progress. Conscience said self-reliance is strength. So the real takeaway, resilience beats efficiency every time. Efficiency says what's cheapest today. Resiliency says what keeps us free tomorrow. So for every business owner who listens to this program, audit your supply chains. Look for U.S. or allied partners now. Be willing to pay a little bit more for independence and freedom down the line. Yes, freedom has a cost, but dependence has a price tag as well. It's far higher in the end. Now, as I see it, China's rise is not destiny, but it is discipline. They plan long term. We choose headlines. I go back. That study I talked to you about yesterday, 20 years ago, American values were family, faith, and country. Today, it's money and influence. We've transitioned core values for temporal things. That won't work in the long run. And we as people have to rediscover the values of patience, faith, and production rooted in purpose. America can outlast any competitor. Our freedom is strong. But we must remember moral strength precedes economic strength. When conscience guides commerce, our nation will endure. When consensus guides it, the nation itself will sell itself one bargain at a time. Now, with all of this, and we look to the markets always to give us a bellwether of how bad or good things really are, despite all the turbulence, Wall Street is just shrugging its shoulders today. Markets have dipped slightly across the broad markets, but they're still hovering near record highs. That tells us that investors still believe in the U.S., they still believe in our productivity and our ability to generate corporate earnings. This is a testimony to our national resilience. It's often been said, don't bet against America, you'll lose. But there is caution. Confidence and complacencies they're twins, and they're separated by a very thin line. When optimism turns to assumptions, well, that's when bubbles build. So if you're invested, as many of you are through 401ks or business reserves, always review your allocations. Trim speculations, shore up your fundamentals, and remember, the market the market can stay euphoric much longer than you can stay liquid. So the deeper meaning of this, markets measure money, conscience measures value. Don't let your portfolio be the only thing you rebalance this fall. So that's a quick look at Friday's news. We focused obviously on the Nobel Prize, but history will vindicate that the fragile peace unfolding in the Mideast is the real value. So while we find on that, we have a grinding war up in Europe, really testing Western endurance, and we have a quiet contest with China shaping up the future of freedom itself. The world is changing, but truth doesn't. And after a quick stop here, we're going to shift. We're going to step away from these headlines, and we're going to talk about the foundations underneath them. Conscience over consensus. So here we go, walking down the spiritual path. As I say, there are 5 things in my life I've determined to be important. And the nature of our spiritual path cannot be overstated. It gives us our grounding for everything. It's the truth by which we measure everything. And that, to me, well, that's the critical thing. So let's talk about conscience over convenience or over consensus. In a world that we live in now that chases approval, it's a call to remember that truth isn't up for a vote. Truth isn't subjective. Truth is. And every age faces that defining test. In ours, the test is the temptation to trade truth for approval. Again, look at the values we hold dear now of influence and money. Look at those two things. These aren't long-term enduring things to strive for. These are short-term temporal things. Consensus has in many ways become the new religion. And the crowd is its high priest. And when I say that, it's because look at the